Hello, so today to continue on the idea of talking about items and some fundamental concepts of TFT, we're going to talk about carry stacking, which is a concept involving how we itemize different units in the game, as well as talking about magnetic removers and how you can, it's some tips on how you can preserve them and use them effectively in your games. If you like my content, please make sure to like and subscribe. It does help me out as a smaller TFT content creator. Additionally, we're working on our 10,000 sub goal RP giveaway, and I'm hoping to hit it by the end of this set. So if you're somebody who likes the channel, you stop by, you watch a couple videos, maybe one of them helped you out, maybe some of them were super fun or enjoyable, please make sure to drop that subscription because it does help me out, and then you can be part of that giveaway when it happens. But anyways, let's talk about carry stacking. So carry stacking, you kind of want to rush 3 items on a particular unit, and it deals with the multiplicative effect of the items that we're using in the game. Before we actually get straight into it, I'm going to do it through a little bit of an example, like some visuals I'm going to draw out here. So bear with me if the audio levels are a bit bad, because sometimes when I'm talking, I'm looking down at what I'm drawing. It might be a little bit awkward. But anyways, we're going to go through 2 scenarios of itemizing a set of units on this little example here. So let's start with this. Let's go here. And let's say this is scenario number 1, right? So for scenario 1, basically what we're going to do is we're going to say, let's say we have 2 damage dealing units. Here we have the little penguins, the cute little penguins that we're going to itemize with items from our item shop. If we're talking about our base, right, our base stats, before we give any items to anybody, let's just write it down, right? Each of them is going to do 1 attack, and they're going to attack once per second. That's going to be like their speed, and then they're going to have basically base 100% damage. They're just doing 100% of damage per attack, basically, right? If we take all of this together, basically what this unit is doing is they're attacking 1 time per second with no modifier on their damage amp. So basically they're doing 1 damage per second, right? And equivalently, this other unit will have the same stats, so they will also be doing 1 damage per second. If this looks a little bit familiar, by the way, I would like to shout out that a lot of this concept pertains a little bit to the previous video that I did on diminishing returns. So this was a prior guide that I did. It also reflects some of the old item guides that I made for set 13. Please make sure to check out this video. I'll make sure to link it above the video in the little eye in the top right corner of the video, so you can check out this video as well as a very similar example in there. But going back to the example we were just talking about, boop. Basically we're doing 1 damage per second on each of these units. Now let's say that we have a total of 3 items that we're going to put on our units, and in this first scenario, let's try and split the item. So I'm going to put scenario 1, I'm going to say split, right? So we're split. Let's say that we take an attack item, right? We're going to give it to this guy, so he's going to get a nice mighty sword, which he can do some extra damage with. We're going to take a speed item, which is going to help his attack speed. So let's just say that we give him a nice cool snazzy little cape that he can wear, and then we'll have some sort of amp, which we'll then put on our other unit. So here, let's say amp is some kind of cool crown that gives you amp abilities, right? So here what we're doing is we're splitting up the items such that we're modifying how much damage each of the units is doing, right? They have a multiplicative effect on our start. So if we're doing +1 attack, 1 + 1 = 2. So now we have 2 attack. If we have +1 speed, we're going to say that we're attacking 2 times per second. So now it's going to be 2 times per second here. And then if we go to this guy, he's going to have a little bit of extra damage amp. So instead of it being 100% damage amp, it's going to be +100%. So he's going to be at 200% damage per attack, right? That's basically the idea. So when we take our modified numbers here, so let's just take a new color. Let's take green, for example. Right, our final will be 2 attack and attacking twice per second with a base of just 100% damage, so no modifiers there. So our final damage is now going to get scaled up to be 4 damage per second, right? So the idea is basically we're attacking twice per second, and we're doing 2 attacks in that time, so it works out to 4 damage. Equivalently, this unit, basically we're getting 100% damage. So instead of being 1 damage per second, now the final is going to be 2 damage per second, right? My guy's a little bit in the way, so give me 1 second. I'm going to move this over. There we go. And if we look at our total, right, our total damage, it's going to be 6 damage per second. Now, of course, I'm doing this with very small numbers in a very simplistic way, just to illustrate the point on a very fundamental concept, because this is not something that just applies to TFT. You can apply this to most strategy or other games where there are modifiers in a similar way. So this is just something that exists in like all types of things, right? Write down right now. So our scenario number 1, our total damage was 6 damage per second. That was with splitting up items between 2 of the units that we're using. So now we're going to start with scenario 2. So we're going to refresh. We're going to get rid of all of this junk. And it's going to follow a very similar example. So I'm going to kind of breeze through this one a little bit. But instead here, we are now going to do, let's do it in pink, right? Let's do pink. And let's go scenario number 2. And then this one will be carry stack. So in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to assume that we have one unit that's going to do the most amount of damage. We're going to put all our items on that one unit in order to realize their full potential and have the maximum multiplicative effect of all the items stacking on top of each other. So in this case, we can go here. We can say that we will take a sword, right? He will get the power up bonus of the sword. He will get the cool attack speed cape. Last time I put the cape through his arm. That's just me being a bad artist. Please don't judge my artworks because, you know, I try my best in the other stuff. When I cool snazzy crown for the damage amp. So if we go through what these modifiers do, so originally, like, you know, from our previous example, it would have been, you know, 1 attack, our base stats, right? I should put base. Base is going to be 1 attack, 1 per second speed, and then 100% damage, meaning that we have 1 damage per second, and then equivalently here we have 1 damage per second. A little bit messy the writing, but I'm just trying to write fast so I don't make the video too long. Hopefully that what I'm saying makes sense in terms of what I'm speaking. But either way, let's go through this now, right? So now we're going to modify each of these. We're going to go like plus to 2. We're going to modify this one to 2, right? Because, oops, sorry, I colored the wrong. There we go. This one's going to be upgraded to 2. And then this one is going to be upgraded to 200%, right? So the idea is that right now, if we take these final numbers, we now do 2 attacks per, and we do 2 attacks per second. Each of them will be with a power of 2 attacks, so it'll basically be like 4 attack per second. And now we have the damage amp, which is multiplicative, which will then multiply all of that by 2, because basically we're gonna have 2 attack, we have 200% damage amp, and we're attacking twice per second. We multiply 2 times 2 times 2. What do we get? We get a total of 8 damage per second. So that's cool. 8 damage per second, and then we also have the 1 damage per second here. And then our total, if we look here, is actually going to be 9 damage per second. So if we go scenario 2, now of course, I would like to say, this is simplistic. We're using numbers of 1s and 2s. We're multiplying. Sometimes the effects of items aren't purely multiplicative, but if you make good items, similar to how I talked about in diminishing returns, you will have a similar output in terms of the damage. But we can easily see that scenario 2 now, we do 9 damage per second. As this is the concept of carry stacking. This is where the idea of carry stacking comes from, because items, if made properly, will multiply with each other and have a multiplicative effect, right? If you have plus AD, you have your unit that has scaling on AD or has scaling via their traits or their abilities. If you give attack speed to that unit, so now they're attacking faster with more AD, and then you give them damage amp and crit chance, and now they're critting and they're getting critical strikes. These things add up together, and if you separate in such a way that the unit is not being very greedy, you're not putting all of the same items on the same unit, you're eventually diminishing the total damage output of your whole team. TFT is very greedy in that way. A lot of times you want to have 3 items on one particular unit because of how powerful the items are together. A unit with no items does nothing. A unit with a single item, they start to get better. As soon as you start to add items together with each other, they will in turn multiply either the tankiness of the unit if they're a frontline unit, or the damage output of the unit if they are a damaging unit. What does this mean for us? It's better to stack items on one unit. This is a fundamental aspect of TFT. Of course, there are parts where this rule breaks, but I want to show you a nice, easy example to kind of illustrate it if you haven't really thought of it, if you can't visualize it well when you're looking at the game. But it's almost always better to stack items on one unit, whether it be a frontline unit or a backline unit. And this is true for most stages in the game. If you want to be stronger at any point in the game, it's almost always better to put the 3 items on the same unit. It also makes it so that sometimes if you're watching like a top level player, or if you're in a lobby with somebody who's like really trying to tempo, their items might look a little bit weird, because basically, like, even though they're not optimal, those just 3 items is 3 items. You just put 3 items on the same unit, and a lot of times that's going to help you a lot. And we'll talk about that with a little bit with examples. So that's why your priority always is rush 3 item tank, 3 item carry. This is especially important if you're playing comps that have multiple carries. You always want to make sure that you are prioritizing 3 good items on one unit, rather than separating your items, AP items here, AD items here, tank items here, because you're effectively diminishing the total damage output of your entire team if you're not rushing to make those 3 items for one particular unit. It's a fundamental thing that really matters a lot, and it can give you a lot of easy placements. It can make you a lot stronger at different stages of the game, and it can also give you a lot higher of a cap, especially if you end up with awkward items that you can't eventually like consolidate, that you have your 3 items on your one unit. Like I said, there are exceptions. One example is like cybernetic augments, where they kind of incentivize you to split up your items a little bit, but even then you still want to have a 3 item carry, 3 item tank, because even if you split up all your items, you know, it's still going to be a little bit rough if you don't have those 3 items on one unit to be like your giga tank and your giga damage dealer. But as a general rule, this is very important. Like I said, you could find exceptions, you could make arguments either way, but then you're just hurting yourself in the long run. It's not a matter of finding all the exceptions to the rule. Just knowing the general rule is going to help you a lot, and this is a fundamental concept that you have to know. Another thing that's really important, which is talk about magnetic removers. Back in my day, which, you know, is a little bit of a joke, because this was like a change that happened within the last year or so, right? But back like a year ago in TFT, like if you started in set 9 like I did, you didn't have as many magnetic removers. They were something that was very difficult to come by. Magnetic removers makes it really easy to put items on a unit and then to rearrange it later, and that helps a lot with tempoing, right? If you have a lot of removers, which you will, because you get 1 per stage, you get 1 per neutral round, you can often itemize a unit and then rearrange those items later. And that's something that's really important when you're thinking about making 3 items on a unit, because if you're trying to carry stack, or if you're trying to be strong in your mid game, or if you make it to like stage 4, or whenever you hit your reroll unit, you always want to put the 3 items on the main unit. And even if they're not the perfect items, you will be a lot stronger than separating your items. And because you have the magnetic removers, you can easily just rearrange your items later and then have a good time later with your 3 perfect items once you get those 3 perfect items. So a lot of times you're balancing between using the removers and saving the removers. But just some general tips on saving removers. We'll come back to this. You usually want, if you want to save removers, so if you're worried that you're going to run out of removers, often a good strategy is that within your early game and your mid game, before you reach your final board, itemizing units that are not going to make it on your final board is a good tip, because basically you can sell that unit and then not have to use a remover in order to get those items. And then another option is to hold extra copies of a unit. So if you itemize a unit and you know that you're going to have to remove items off that unit, if it's a unit that's important to your final board, you can hold extra copies so long as it doesn't grief your econ, in order to make sure that you can then rearrange the items later. So now we're going to go through a little bit of an example. So a lot of times, you know, let's say you start your game off early, and let's say you have like some random unit, like let's say you have like a Seraphine, and you don't know what you're going to be playing. Like let's say it's like Seraphine, and let's take like let's just put some random units here, right? We have Bastion and Techie. Sure, let's do Zyra. There we go. This is a cool board, right? Not the greatest board, but just units to illustrate for this example. I have good Exotech items. I'm probably going to play around Exotech. You know, something that's really important that you can do is try and make your Exotech items. So sometimes, you know, you might make a Gwynsu if you want to play around Zeri. Even though you don't have necessarily a Zeri to play around, you can put on a Seraphine, right? Having an item on a unit is going to make it more effective than not. And then Seraphine, obviously not going to make it onto your final board, so you can easily sell the Seraphine later and then play something else in place of that unit. You can also make other items that might be good. For example, let's say you're trying to tempo and you're trying to streak. Another item that might be something that comes up is something like a Giant Slayer, maybe, right? Like, let's say these are your 2 items. Not perfect items right now, but I'm just saying it's better to itemize this unit in particular than it is to split your items and put them on separate units. This is something that's pretty often accessible in your early game, or pretty obvious in your early game. Now, what happens if you get another item that's not necessarily the greatest item? Let's say you make like a Hodge, right? like, you know, let's say that's what that we're just throwing out random items here, not ones that particularly make sense. Now Hodge, so you might want to put it on your frontline unit, for example. In a lot of cases, because your Seraphine already has 2 items on her, this is where carry stacking comes into play. If you want to actually make a stronger board, splitting up the Hodge onto your front line versus your back line is often not going to be super great, because one item on the unit isn't going to be that much of a power spike relative to having a 3rd item on your carry unit. Now obviously these items are horrible, we're going to delete them in a second, I was just picking random stuff here, but the whole point that I'm trying to say is it doesn't matter whether or not the item, if the item is plausible that you can use it on a certain unit, you can put it on the same unit. Even in this case, if you have like a Seraphine 2-star or something, you know, you can still put something like an IE on the Seraphine in your early game, because you could just remove it or get rid of it later, because like it's fine as long as like you have 3 items on the same unit. It's going to make a lot more sense than splitting up your items and putting it on separate units. That's like the first little thing that I want to talk about. The second thing I want to talk about is just in general removers. So let's say now we're going to actually make like a proper board talking about exotech, right? And then you have like the Jin, and maybe you're playing something that looks like a little bit like this, for example, right? Let's find a Morgana, right? Like this is a common board that you sometimes see. You know, you activate Dynamo, you play around your front line, your back line, you play around Exotech, and then maybe you get Exotech in, and then you can play like your Mordekaiser or something afterwards, right? This is like a common board that you lean into like Exotech if you have good Exotech items, which is still something relevant this patch, right? Let's take similar items here. Let's take like a items for this Jin, for example, right? So let's say here I'm trying to itemize Jin because the Jin is like my AD unit, he's particularly strong. So let's just take like, you know, our Zeri items, you put them on your Jin, right? And then your other items, let's say we have this guy 2-star, so we put our tank items on the Jax, for example, right? Something like this. Let's imagine these are our items. So often what's going to be really beneficial here is to stack items on the units that are the strongest. So obviously I just put the items on the Jin, and I put the items on the Jax because the Jax is upgraded. If I was in a spot where I think that I want to really save my removers, if I'm playing Exotech, Jax is going to be on the final board. So if I itemize this Jax, it means that in the future, I'm going to have to use a magnetic remover in order to remove these items. If we go back, this is what I was talking about with these tips for magnetic removers, right? You want to itemize units that are not on the final board. This is often really important if you are trying to save removers, like you know for sure you're going to need some. So for example, this Jin, I know I'm going to have to move these items off this Jin. I know I'm going to have to move these items off this Jax. That's already 2 items that I have to worry about removing and moving around a lot. Additionally, let's say I hit a Mordekaiser 2-star. If I hit a Mordekaiser 2-star, this is going to be stronger in my mid game if I'm trying to streak, so I might want to put these items on the Mordekaiser eventually. So I already know that I'm going to be using multiple sets of removers in this game. Something that can help is that if I have a Poppy 2 or a Jax 2, for example, I can often put the items on the Poppy, because Poppy, especially if you're playing Exotech, doesn't fit into the final board. What this allows me to do in order to itemize the better tank, which in this case will be Mordekaiser, and then I can transition in my mid game to playing around Mordekaiser 2 with the, sorry, I think I had the knockoff Jax show, whatever it's called, Adaptive Helm. Right, and then I can transition to playing the items on the Mordekaiser instead, because the Mordekaiser is going to be really strong and really tanky in the mid game. So this is something you can do, right? If you have a unit that you know isn't going to be on your final board, so long as you're not griefing your econ or griefing your board, this is something that you can only really do if you have like a really good case for it. So in this case, I have Poppy 2, Jax 2. It's something that I can do if I want to play really greedy and save removers. This was something that was a lot more common in the past. Of course, you could just use removers every single round. Just keep track of how many removers you need for your final board. So for example, if I itemize this Jax, I know that I need 1 remover for Jax eventually, because he's not going to be my tank at the final game. I'm going to need 1 remover for this Jin, because I'm eventually going to move these items to Zeri. So I always have to keep 2 removers available, and I get 1 per stage, so I have to keep a bank of having 2 removers. So I have 2 removers by the time I reach the stage that I'm going to need to transfer my items over. That's something that's just important to keep track of. If you are already using removers, let's say you used a remover already because these were on a Kindred, and then you have to put them here, then you, in order to preserve your removers, you might want to stack your items on a unit that you can then sell in order to make that a little bit better. Additionally, I'm going to move these units up. Pretend this is on my bench. Another tip you can do, you don't like, I'm not going for Jax 3 here, right? But something you can do is if you see extra copies of units that you're going to play on your board, you can also hold them on your bench, because that way you can downgrade or sell the Jax in order to get them off without using your remover. So that's generally 2 tips. If you're struggling like in your game and you find that you can't save removers that often, you're always running out of removers, those are 2 tips that you want to keep in mind. Just generally, that's how you used to kind of play the game. This was like a very important concept, but it's a little bit dated because obviously you get so many magnetic removers nowadays. And when you're using magnetic removers, like I said, it's always better to 3 item your carry and your main tank. So if you have items, for example, let's say you have exotech items, and let's say one of your exotech items is like, let's pick one. Oh, sorry, I'm on the wrong spot. Hollow Bow. Hollow Bow is a great example, right? So let's say we have Hollow Bow here, right? And let's say we have what's his name, Varus, right? Where is Varus? Varus, right? Hollow Bow is a really good example because it's a really good item on Varus. It's typically considered to be like the recommended Varus item, right? They say you can also use it on Jhin and Zeri. They buffed it a little bit to work on Jhin and Zeri, but it's not super high cap on them in my opinion. But if I had to pick who to itemize here between these ones, right? Who am I going to put this on? Am I going to split up the Exotech item because this is a better Varus item? No, we're going to make sure that our Jhin has 3 items. Or, in the worst case scenario, if we have like a Varus 2 and we only have like a Jhin 1 and you don't think that the Jhin is strong enough, you put all 3 items on the same unit. It's just going to help your damage output. So that's something that can help you in your mid game to save a lot of HP, and it's also going to help you in your late game because you also have to use less removers. If you split up all your items, right, then you need more removers to use all these items. So it actually works really effectively if you're just always gunning to have 3 items on your units. And that's, anyways, that was the example. Just briefly, just to reiterate from the little drawn example, this was a little bit of a shorter concept, but like I said, I kind of took the previous item guides, I kind of split them out throughout the set. Originally I was going to put them all together and make like a really good one, just like a really detailed guide on like how to deal with items and all of that. But it just worked out that this set was just miserable in terms of like all the changes they made to items and item drops, and it just never felt relevant for me to make a dedicated solo item guide. Instead I just split it up as the set went on. Hopefully this was, you know, clear, or it helped you out a little bit. Like I said, this is something that's usually mentioned in TFT. I think a lot of people, if you just watch anybody, they usually talk about this. This is just like, you know, a more formal explanation with a little bit of a outside TFT example to make it a little bit clearer. So hopefully it was informative, hopefully it was fun. Have a great day, and see ya. Bye bye.